What if the Norse colonized the Americas? Many people say that Columbus discovered the Americas, but that is not true in any way, shape, or form. First of all, people from Asia had crossed the Bering Strait to discover the New World thousands of years before Columbus was even born. And besides that, Columbus wasn't even the first European to discover the Americas. That had already been done by the Vikings, about 500 years earlier. So I still don't understand why Columbus gets all the credit. Anyway, that is beside the point. The reason why no one heard about the Vikings in North America was because the ruins of their settlement was only found in about 1960. Oh, and they didn't stay too long either. Leif Erikson first wintered in Newfoundland in 1001. The Vikings did return on and off, but they didn't stay permanently. They could never truly settle down and exploit the resources in North America. This is because of hostile relations with the Native Americans. In an incident known as the Battle of Vinland in 1003, some Viking dude killed 8 Native Americans, although one escaped and came back with a bigger force. The Vikings and natives duked it out, and the man that had slaughtered the natives died. So you kind of see why the Vikings couldn't simply remain in North America. There's a simple remedy to this: establish good relations with the Native Americans. In the year 1009, a sign of this possibility came tantalizingly close to fruition. I mean, a Viking dude called Thorfinn the Valiant came to the region with a bunch of men and then bartered with the natives in goods such as fur and squirrel skins. Yeah, good times. If this kind of peaceful relationship were to last, which is entirely possible, then what would happen next? Well, you might say that if the Norsemen were to settle down, their old world diseases would wipe out the ranks of the natives. Well, this is a complicated question to answer. Would the Vikings have wiped out the natives due to disease? Well, I'm not saying that the Vikings didn't have disease. Sure, they might have been slightly more clean than the average European of the time, but they still raised livestock and farmed. And it was this close proximity with farm animals that first brought so much disease to humans in the New World. The main reason why we don't hear of such a large epidemic in our timeline is because not many Native Americans came into contact with the Vikings. In the year 10,000, there were probably a few small tribes on the island of Newfoundland. The vast portions of it were uninhabited. This means that even if any disease were to spread to these groups, they would probably just die out, and the disease would be contained by the vast distances between each settlement. Another reason is probably because the Vikings themselves were not that conducive to disease. For example, the Viking settlement on Iceland and Greenland were basically isolated and cut off from the rest of Europe. This means that any disease that would occur in Europe had a slim chance of reaching Iceland, and in turn Greenland and Finland, and Viking settlement in North America. For the first few hundred years of Viking colonization, either the natives in Newfoundland would die off or slowly build up an immunity to the disease. Anyway, the Vikings would spread extremely slowly. They were not the type of colonizers like Columbus, who would get in your face and slaughter all the people and exploit your resources. The Vikings would colonize on a smaller scale, and probably wouldn't even know that it was a new continent that they were settling on. After spreading from Newfoundland south along the North American coast, we can expect to see more large-scale plagues and disease. This is because they would be coming into contact with more tribes and densely populated areas. Even if there wasn't a disease on the scale of smallpox coming from the Vikings, there would still be other traditional old world diseases, not deadly to the Vikings but very deadly to the natives. We could see a large decimation of the native population. although not on a scale as large as we saw hundreds of years later during the voyages of the Age of Exploration. First of all, the population would be smaller since we are talking about 500 years before Columbus, and this means that the population density is smaller, so there's less chance of a disease spreading throughout the entire continent. Anyway, even if a large percent of the population dies off, they will eventually develop an immunity to it. Another major change that will happen will be the early introduction of livestock. Even if the Vikings weren't actively giving away livestock to the natives, some would escape, and soon Native Americans would be chasing bison on horses on the plains, or raising livestock for food in the villages. Anyway, after several hundred years, the Norse population probably wouldn't amount to more than 10,000 individuals scattered in towns across the coast. This is because the North American population would probably be fed entirely from Iceland and Greenland, and those places didn't have much of a population. Greenland would likely become a way station to the New World. On the topic of religion, by the year 10,000, Christianity was beginning to convert Iceland, and in turn, this would spread to the New World. There would be a mix of paganism and Christianity among the Norsemen until finally Christianity would become the dominant religion of the Vikings. I don't think the Vikings would be as fanatical in spreading it to the natives as the Spanish, however, being relatively recent converts. The Vikings would gradually intermarry with the natives, who would have a much larger population than them. After a while, there would be very few pure Vikings left, and mostly intermixed peoples. How would the rest of Europe react to this? Well, Europe during this time was still basically cut off from the rest of the world, and not really concerned with outside affairs. Also, the Vikings were isolated from the rest of Europe, so I don't see a mass exodus of migrants to the New World. I think that the Renaissance and the revival of the culture of science and exploration would have to take place for Europeans to have any real interest in going to the New World. By that time, they will likely have seen some vague notion of a new continent, having heard stories by word of mouth. And they will be much more prone to exploring. However, this time the colonies will be much tougher to colonize. If the Vikings were have to already establish colonies in the New World, the natives would already be immune to most Old World disease, and that was a huge advantage to the colonist. Colonizing would be much harder to do, especially against people on horses with metal weapons. Guns would probably be the only advantage colonizers have. In this timeline, natives rule over the Americas, and Europe remains a largely backward continent. Thanks for watching, and this is Scholar of the World, signing out.